Dale Earnhardt didn't believe in fear. For 26 years, this philosophy made him NASCAR's most intimidating champion. 7 Winston Cups earned through aggressive blocks and bumper-to-bumper warfare at 190 miles per hour. On February 18, 2001, at 4:21 p.m., those beliefs met reality on Turn 4 at Daytona. The irony, Earnhardt was playing defense. The greatest offensive driver in NASCAR history spent his final lap protecting his teammates, Michael Waltrip leading, Dale Jr. in second, Sr. running third as a human shield. When Sterling Marlin's Dodge tapped Earnhardt's left rear coming out of Turn 3, the physics became inevitable. The black number 3 Chevrolet slid toward the wall at 160 miles per hour, collected Ken Schrader's Pontiac, and hit concrete at a 45-degree angle. The crash didn't look catastrophic. No fire, no tumbling, the car superficially intact. When Schrader climbed out and ran to Earnhardt's window, fans expected heated words. What he saw made him wave for medical personnel with desperate urgency. Dale Earnhardt was beyond help, and NASCAR would never be the same. To understand what killed Dale Earnhardt requires understanding the specific hell of restrictor plate racing at Daytona and Talladega, NASCAR's 2 fastest superspeedways. The restrictor plate itself, a thin aluminum square with 4 precisely sized holes installed between the carburetor and intake manifold, was NASCAR's solution to speeds that had become genuinely terrifying by the late 1980s. At the 1987 Winston 500 at Talladega, Bill Elliott had qualified at 212.809 miles per hour, a speed that made the physics of a tire failure or mechanical breakdown potentially catastrophic, not just for drivers, but for spectators. Bobby Allison's Buick had nearly gone into the grandstands at Talladega in 1987 after a tire failure at 200+ miles per hour. NASCAR's response was the restrictor plate, mandated for Daytona and Talladega starting in 1988, choking engine airflow and dropping speeds into the 180 to 190 miles per hour range. The unintended consequence was pack racing. With horsepower artificially limited, aerodynamics became everything. A single car had no hope of breaking away from the field. The draft was too powerful, the speed differential too small. Instead, the entire pack bunched together, running nose to tail, side by side, 3 wide, sometimes 4 wide, into corners at speeds that would have been considered dangerously fast in isolation. The restrictor plate had eliminated 20 miles per hour from top speeds, while somehow making racing more dangerous, not less. Any slight mistake, any mechanical failure, any aggressive move gone wrong could collect 15 cars in a heartbeat. The plates had turned Daytona and Talladega into 40-car games of highway chicken played at 190 miles per hour. Earnhardt had mastered this chaos better than anyone. He'd won the Daytona 500 in 1998 after 20 years of heartbreaking failures, and the restrictor plate superspeedways had become his specialty in the late 1990s. He understood the draft instinctively, knew exactly where to position his car to get a run on the straightaway, when to block and when to let someone push from behind. His aggressive style, the bump and run, the late blocks, the willingness to make contact when necessary, was perfectly suited to restrictor plate racing's claustrophobic violence. But in February 2001, Dale Earnhardt was 49 years old, a grandfather supposedly mellowing. He'd started Dale Earnhardt Inc. and fielded cars for other drivers. His son was now his teammate. The 2001 Daytona 500 was supposed to showcase DEI's arrival as a championship-contending organization. Instead, it became NASCAR's darkest day. NASCAR in 2001 operated under safety protocols that had evolved incrementally over decades but remained fundamentally rooted in 1970s technology and attitudes. The cars ran full-roll cages, 5-point harnesses, fuel cells, and window nets, Drivers wore fire-resistant suits, full-face helmets, and, if they chose, the Hans device, a head and neck restraint that had been available since the early 1990s, but remained optional. The tracks had safer barriers at some locations, though Daytona's concrete walls were largely unprotected. The philosophy seemed to be that stock car racing was inherently dangerous, that real men accepted those risks, and that the current safety measures were adequate because they'd worked well enough so far. This attitude was spectacularly wrong, and the warning signs had been accumulating with lethal clarity. In 2000 alone, NASCAR had lost 4 drivers. Adam Petty, fourth-generation racer and grandson of Richard Petty, died in a practice crash at New Hampshire Motor Speedway in May. Kenny Irwin Jr. died at the same track 3 months later in an eerily similar accident. Tony Roper died in a Craftsman Truck Series race at Texas Motor Speedway in October. In February 2001, 2 days before the Daytona 500, Blaze Alexander died in an ARCA race at Daytona after his car went airborne and hit an exposed concrete wall. The sport was hemorrhaging drivers, and the response had been largely defensive. These were different series, different circumstances, unfortunate but isolated incidents. The fundamental safety architecture of NASCAR remained unchanged. The Hans device exemplified the problem. Developed by Dr. Robert Hubbard, a biomechanical engineering professor, the head and neck support device was a U-shaped collar that fit over the driver's shoulders and attached to the helmet via tethers, limiting violent head movement during sudden deceleration. Testing had shown it dramatically reduced the risk of basilar skull fractures, the injury that had killed Earnhardt, Petty, Irwin, and most NASCAR drivers who died in seemingly survivable crashes. The device had been commercially available since 1991. By 2001, it had proven its worth in Formula One and kart racing. Dale Earnhardt refused to wear one, calling it uncomfortable and restrictive. NASCAR didn't mandate it. The culture of toughness, of driver choice, of personal responsibility meant that proven safety technology sat in equipment bags while drivers died from preventable injuries. The seatbelts told the same story. Earnhardt ran his belts loose, common practice among veteran drivers who wanted freedom to move, to reach controls, to climb out quickly in case of fire. The problem was that loose belts allowed excessive body movement during impact, increasing the forces transmitted to the head and neck. When Earnhardt's car hit the wall, his body continued forward while the car stopped, and his head snapped forward and down with catastrophic force. The 5-point harness wasn't properly tightened. The Hans device wasn't worn. The concrete wall had no energy-absorbing, safer barrier. The perfect storm of preventable factors had aligned, and the result was a basilar skull fracture that killed him instantly. NASCAR initially treated Earnhardt's death with the reverent opacity typically reserved for fallen presidents. The sport's most famous driver, its biggest star, the man who transcended racing to become a genuine American cultural icon, had died during its most prestigious race, broadcast live to millions. The immediate response was grief, shock, and an almost instinctive circling of the wagons. NASCAR President Mike Helton, in his first Daytona 500 as the sports leader, delivered the news with stark simplicity. "We've lost Dale Earnhardt." The words hung in the air like a death sentence for the sport itself. What followed was a masterclass in how not to handle a safety crisis. NASCAR initially refused to release the autopsy report, citing Florida privacy laws and respect for the Earnhardt family. This opacity immediately spawned conspiracy theories that Earnhardt had been decapitated, that the crash had been far more violent than it appeared, that NASCAR was hiding evidence of negligence. The reality was both simpler and more damning. Dale Earnhardt had died from a basilar skull fracture, the same injury that had killed 4 NASCAR drivers the previous year. an injury that the Hans device was specifically designed to prevent. The autopsy revealed that Earnhardt's left lap belt had separated from its mounting point during the crash, allowing his body to slide forward and to the right. The belt failure was later attributed to improper installation during pre-race preparation. Everything about the crash sequence, from the equipment choices to the belt installation to the lack of safer barriers, represented failures that were entirely preventable. Dr. Barry Myers, a Duke University biomedical engineer brought in to analyze the crash, eventually released findings that laid bare the systemic failures. The steering column had contacted Earnhardt's chest during the collision. The left lap belt had detached or broken. The non-usage of the Hans device had allowed fatal head and neck movement. The concrete wall had absorbed none of the impact energy. Any one of several different safety measures, proper belt installation, mandatory Hans device, safer barriers, better seat design, might have saved his life. The cumulative effect of multiple failures had been lethal, and NASCAR could no longer pretend these were isolated incidents or acceptable risks. NASCAR's transformation after Earnhardt's death was swift, comprehensive, and unprecedented. Within months, the sport mandated the Hans device or an equivalent head and neck restraint for all drivers. The decision was controversial. Many drivers complained about comfort and restriction, but NASCAR had learned that optional safety equipment wasn't working. The safer steel and foam energy reduction barrier, already installed at some tracks, became mandatory at every facility hosting NASCAR races. These energy-absorbing barriers, consisting of steel tubes backed by foam blocks, could dissipate crash forces that concrete walls simply transmitted directly to the car and driver. Seat specifications were tightened. Belt installation procedures were standardized and subjected to rigorous inspection. The window net design was improved. Roof flaps were refined. The sport essentially audited every single safety protocol and found most of them wanting. The financial investment was massive. Installing safer barriers at every NASCAR track cost tens of millions of dollars. Developing new safety equipment, conducting crash testing, implementing inspection protocols, all of this required resources that NASCAR and track owners had previously declined to invest. The implicit calculation had been that racing was dangerous, that fans understood this, and that the current safety measures represented an acceptable balance between cost and risk. Earnhardt's death obliterated that calculus. The risk was no longer acceptable, and the cost became irrelevant. The sport had lost its biggest star, and the economic impact of that loss in fan interest, sponsor confidence, media coverage, and cultural relevance dwarfed any safety expenditure. The impact extended beyond NASCAR. Formula One, IndyCar, sports car racing, every major motorsport re-evaluated its safety protocols in the wake of Daytona. The Hans device became universal. Barrier technology improved across all series. Crash testing became more sophisticated. The culture shifted from one where safety measures were seen as optional or even cowardly to one where refusing to implement proven safety technology was considered negligent. Dr. Robert Hubbard, whose Hans device had been dismissed as uncomfortable or unnecessary for years, suddenly couldn't manufacture them fast enough to meet demand. Since Dale Earnhardt's death on February 18, 2001, exactly 0 NASCAR Cup Series drivers have died in on-track competition. 0. This statistic is so remarkable, so unprecedented in the sport's history, that it borders on miraculous. In the 20 years before Earnhardt's death, NASCAR lost dozens of drivers across its various series. In the 20 years after, the Cup Series death toll has been 0. This isn't luck. This isn't coincidence. This is what happens when a sport finally acknowledges that safety isn't negotiable, that driver deaths aren't acceptable losses, that the culture of toughness and personal choice had been killing people who could have been saved. The crashes haven't stopped, of course. Ryan Newman's horrific wreck on the final lap of the 2020 Daytona 500, his car going airborne, flipping, and landing on its roof while sliding across the track, would have been unsurvivable in 2001. Newman walked away with minor injuries. Austin Dillon's crash at Daytona in 2015, where his car went into the catch fence and disintegrated, scattering debris into the grandstands, resulted in injuries to fans, but Dillon emerged unharmed. The physics of racing at 200 miles per hour haven't changed. What changed was the acknowledgement that those physics require sophisticated engineering countermeasures, not just bravery and roll cages. The transformation extended to NASCAR's culture itself. The sport that had lionized Dale Earnhardt for his aggressive, fearless style, the bump and run, the intimidation, the willingness to wreck competitors if necessary, began emphasizing sportsmanship and safety. The old-school mentality that real racers didn't complain about danger, didn't wear uncomfortable safety equipment, didn't back down, was gradually replaced by a more professional approach. Drivers became vocal advocates for safety improvements rather than stoic acceptors of risk. When young drivers expressed concerns about track conditions or car behavior, they were taken seriously rather than dismissed as weak. The sport grew up, and it grew up fast. The deepest irony of Dale Earnhardt's death is that the man who embodied NASCAR's old-school damn the torpedoes approach to racing became the catalyst for its modernization. Earnhardt represented everything NASCAR had been: Southern, working-class, aggressive, unapologetically masculine, suspicious of change and outsiders. His black No. 3 Chevrolet, his signature mustache, his refusal to smile for cameras unless he felt like it, all of it projected an image of NASCAR as a sport for real men who understood that danger was part of the job. His death, and the safety revolution it triggered, effectively ended that era. NASCAR after 2001 became more corporate, more safety-conscious, more willing to embrace technology and change. The sport Earnhardt loved wouldn't have mandated the hands device, wouldn't have spent millions on safer barriers, wouldn't have prioritized driver safety over tradition and toughness. And yet, posthumously, Earnhardt became NASCAR's greatest safety advocate. The Dale Earnhardt Foundation, established after his death, has funded countless safety initiatives. The research conducted in the wake of his crash has saved lives not just in racing but in automotive safety generally. Much of what we know about basilar skull fractures, seatbelt dynamics, and crash barrier effectiveness came from analyzing what went wrong on February 18, 2001. The man who refused to wear the hands device became the reason every driver now wears one. The driver who ran his belts loose became the impetus for standardized installation protocols. The competitor who dismissed safety concerns as weakness became NASCAR's patron saint of driver protection. Dale Earnhardt Inc., the race team he'd built, struggled after his death and eventually merged with other organizations. But not before his son, Dale Jr., became NASCAR's most popular driver for 15 consecutive years. The number 3 was retired, returned briefly, retired again. A number so associated with one man that putting anyone else in it felt like sacrilege. Earnhardt's legacy in racing remains complicated, celebrated for his 7 championships and aggressive brilliance, while being forever tied to the safety failures that killed him. He wanted to be remembered as the greatest driver of his generation. Instead, he's remembered as the driver, whose death finally forced NASCAR to acknowledge that greatness shouldn't require martyrdom. Walk through the garage area at any NASCAR race today, and you'll see the physical manifestation of February 18, 2001. Every driver wears a hands device or equivalent, the white collar and helmet tethers visible through the window nets. The seat surrounds the driver like a racing cockpit, engineered to limit movement and distribute forces. The belts, 6-point now, not 5, are installed by certified technicians and inspected before every session. The cars themselves have evolved into safety capsules with reinforced door bars, energy-absorbing steering columns, and roof structures designed to maintain integrity during multiple impacts and rollovers. The window openings are smaller, protected by Lexan panels. The fuel cell is surrounded by crush zones that keep it intact even during the most violent collisions. The tracks have been transformed. Safer barriers line every concrete wall at every NASCAR facility, the distinctive steel and foam construction standing as a visible commitment to crashworthiness. The catch fences have been reinforced and redesigned to contain cars while minimizing the risk of debris entering spectator areas. Medical response protocols have been standardized. Every track has the same level of emergency equipment, staffed by trauma specialists who train specifically for racing injuries. The time from crash to hospital has been minimized through helicopter transport protocols and partnerships with nearby trauma centers. The culture has shifted most dramatically. When a driver raises safety concerns, NASCAR responds immediately rather than dismissing them as complaints from someone who isn't tough enough. When new technology becomes available, the carbon fiber seat surrounds, the improved fire suppression systems, the next generation HANS devices, NASCAR mandates adoption rather than leaving it to driver choice. The sport learned, painfully and permanently, that optional safety equipment means some drivers will choose not to use it, and some of those drivers will die from preventable injuries. The paternalism is now explicit. NASCAR will make the hard choices for drivers, because left to their own devices, some drivers will make decisions that get them killed. The cost has been measured not just in dollars, but in the fundamental character of the sport. NASCAR in 2024 is safer, more professional, more technologically sophisticated than Dale Earnhardt's NASCAR. It's also arguably less authentic, less connected to its roots, less southern and working class, and dangerous. The tracks are corporate entertainment complexes. The drivers are media-trained athletes who speak in sponsor-friendly sound bites. The cars, despite looking like Chevrolets and Fords and Toyotas, are purpose-built racing machines that share almost nothing with their showroom counterparts. NASCAR's journey from outlaw sport to mainstream entertainment has been accelerated by safety mandates, each new regulation pulling the sport further from its stock car origins. Whether this trade-off, authenticity for safety, danger for survival, represents progress or loss depends entirely on your perspective. But the 0 deaths in Cup Series competition since 2001 suggest NASCAR made the correct choice. Dale Earnhardt. Senior's final moments have been analyzed with forensic precision. The trajectory of the crash, the forces involved, the sequence of failures that proved fatal. But the emotional resonance of those moments extends far beyond biomechanics and engineering analysis. For NASCAR fans who grew up watching the black number 3 intimidate competitors, who'd seen Earnhardt win championships through sheer determination and aggressive brilliance, who'd celebrated his long-delayed Daytona 500 victory in 1998 with genuine joy, the crash in Turn 4 represented something more than one driver's death. It represented the end of an era, the moment when NASCAR's mythology of toughness and danger collided with reality and lost. The sport's response, swift, comprehensive, expensive, and non-negotiable, validated the gravity of that loss. NASCAR didn't just implement new safety rules, it fundamentally restructured its relationship with risk. The old acceptance that racing was dangerous and people would die, that this was simply part of the sport, was replaced by an aggressive commitment to engineering away the lethality. Every rule change, every barrier installation, every mandated safety device represented NASCAR's acknowledgement that Dale Earnhardt's death was preventable. and that preventing future deaths was worth any cost, any cultural shift, any loss of authenticity. 23 years later, the legacy of February 18, 2001, permeates every aspect of NASCAR. The sport is safer, cleaner, more professional, less dangerous, less authentic, more corporate, less regional, more diverse, more technologically sophisticated, and fundamentally altered from what it was when Dale Earnhardt was alive. The man who refused to wear a hands device became the reason every driver must wear one. The competitor who embodied NASCAR's old-school toughness became the catalyst for its modernization. The driver who died from preventable injuries became NASCAR's most powerful safety advocate, his death saving countless lives through the changes it forced. In the end, Dale Earnhardt got the legacy he wanted. He's remembered as one of NASCAR's greatest champions, a 7-time winner of the Winston Cup, the intimidator whose aggressive style changed how stock car racing was driven. But he also got a legacy he never anticipated. Patron saint of a safety revolution he would have resisted while alive. The driver whose death proved that toughness alone wasn't enough. That bravery couldn't defeat physics, that NASCAR's culture of danger needed to end. The irony would probably have annoyed him. The lives saved because of his death would probably have made him proud. Either way, the black number 3 Chevrolet sliding into the Turn 4 wall at Daytona International Speedway remains the most consequential single moment in NASCAR history. The last lap of one era and the starting grid of another. Ooh.